All right. We are in, once again, Hilchos Isturei Bia, the laws of forbidden relationships, chapter 18. Okay. Everybody with us here? Let's begin.
Yep.
Mipia Shemua Lamdu. We're going to, I mentioned this before, we're going to go through, the Rambam is still going through kind of each chapter has a definition and then the implications of said definition. So we're going to start with a new definition and then we're going to have the implications halachically of that. And how it interplays with other situations will be based on a number of strong Gemara fundamentals, which then have their applications in halachic scenarios. And we'll try to touch them as we go through them. The definition we're going to be working with primarily today is what's called a zona. Now, a zona is used in modern Hebrew completely differently, and we have nothing to do with that description or that type of a way to use the word. A zona, as we're going to learn very soon at the beginning, is a very specific, narrow halachic legal definition. And because of that, it has certain specific halachic applications. And that's what we're going to start learning going in today's parak. Parak Yud Ches. Aleph, number 1. Mepia Shmuel Lamdu, from the Torah Shebal Peh, from the oral tradition, we've learned Shazona ha'amura b'Torah, that when the Torah uses the term zona, he calls she'ena bas Yisrael. It means somebody who is not Jewish. Or bas Yisrael shenivela la'adam she'asur lehi nasaloi iser hashava b'ko. Or a Jewish lady who had relations with someone she's not allowed to, but the type of a prohibition that is forbidden to all equally. And we're going to explain some of these as we go through the next couple of things as well. Or if she had relations with a chalal, a chalal or a chalala is a person born from a forbidden relationship with a kohen. In the next chapter, actually, the Rambam's going to spend more time explaining the definition of the chalal and the chalala. For the moment, it's someone who is born from a relationship of a kohen with a forbidden for the kohen to marry person. Now, chalal is interesting that the child is born from a forbidden relationship, even though the child technically may be allowed to marry a certain person. But even then, that person may take on the definition of the zona. What does that mean? Stay tuned as we go through the applications. But the Rambam continues with the definition. Therefore, hanivaz lebehema, someone has a relationship with an animal. Alpha bishibeskila, even though that person who has relations with an animal is liable to be killed by execution of stoning. She does not become what we classify as a zona in that circumstance. And she is not forbidden to marry a kohen. Why? She did not have relations with a person. And if a person has relations with a lady while she's during her nida cycle, even though then both of them again are liable for punishment of kares, nonetheless, she has not become a zona. And she is not forbidden to a kohen. Like she was never forbidden to be married. In other words, you're allowed to marry a nida. You're just forbidden to have relations during the nida period. So therefore, the Rambam says, since it's not an Isser HaShava, it's not a relationship which is forbidden, therefore she would not become a zona. Base. And again, a lot of this is going to be explained hopefully over the next halachot as we explain in more with detail. If someone has relations with an unmarried lady, even if she was a kedesha. Kedesha is translated usually like a harlot. She allows herself to have relations with anyone. Even though it's forbidden to do that, and you will be liable to be punished with what we call malkos, which is lashes. Lo nasa zoina v'lo nisla lakuna. She has not become a zona, and she has not become forbidden to the Kohen. Shari Nasruli Nasruli, she never became forbidden to marry him. Now, we're going to talk more in a minute about some of these details, but just as I said at the beginning, for those who joined, the term zona is used often as slang in today, contemporary language, references more what we just said is not a zona. So the halachic definition and usage of the term is very, very different. And we're going to only focus, obviously, on that usage of the term. But the Rambam continues, somebody, if a lady had relations with someone who she's forbidden to, in a relationship which is forbidden universally to everyone. Or it's forbidden with a relationship from a positive, that positive commandment for them not allowed to be married. Or someone she's forbidden because of erva is so relationships, so like a sister or brother, or someone of that. Or to a non-Jew or to a slave. Since she is forbidden to marry that person, she would become in those cases halachically called a zona. Gimel, the Rambam continues. And so to a female who converts, or a maidservant who's set free. Even if she converted, or if she was redeemed from being a maidservant under the age of 3 years old. Since at that point, she is not a Bas Yisrael, she wasn't born as a Jew at that point, she is considered a Zaina. We take on the idea that relations might have happened, we don't know, in a different culture, in a different lifestyle perhaps, and therefore she might have become a Zona, therefore her Cohen should not marry her.
Rabbi.
Yes.
What exactly, what's the exact definition of Zona? Exactly.
So that was the opening paragraph of the chapter. The definition is someone who, if you go back to the number 1, somebody who is not Jewish, or someone who had relationships with a person who universally everyone is forbidden to marry. In other words, not just a relationship that a Cohen had with a lady, or not just a particular relationship, but a universally accepted across the board prohibition, that would create, or with a chalal. Chalal, someone was born from a forbidden relationship with a Cohen.
So the person...
I'm going to explain it a little bit more as well. Okay? Stay tuned for the next line, for next little bit. The Rambam is going to continue and explain this as we go through further. Okay? Tanamru. First said, Goy, I Evet, I Nasin, I Mamzer, or Geramoini Umayavi. If somebody is a non-Jewish or a slave, I Nasin is from an individual group of people that we'll learn about in the Rambam other times. I Mamzer, or someone that we learned last chapter, is considered a halachic Mamzer. I Ger, or convert from Ammon and Moab, which are forbidden to relation to convert and get married. Or they're Egyptians, or from Edom, an Edomite convert who's also the first 2 generations forbidden to marry a Jew. Or someone up to a Daka Krishivcha, which we learned already, has a certain level of castration or on their part, their genitals. Or Chalal, or someone who's considered a Chalal, like we said, who's a child of a forbidden relationship with a Kohen. Shabau al Yehudis. And one of these above mentioned people had relations with a Jewish lady. Also, I says Zona v'nisla kuna, they make her a Zona, and she is forbidden to marry a Kohen. All of these things that we mentioned above are universal. No Jew is allowed to marry these people, period. It's not just a certain type of people at a certain time, it's a universal. Therefore, they would make her a Zona, and she's not allowed to marry a Kohen. V'im Heiser Kohanis, and if she was a Kohen herself, Nifsala min truma, she can no longer marry truma. V'chein yavama sheba'ala zar. Same thing as a yavama that we learned already. The halachas of a yavama. Yavama is the lady who's waiting to marry the brother. Her husband passes away, and another person comes and has relations with her during that time. She also becomes a zona because she's forbidden to anyone but the brother at that point. The island is with us, and an island is which we learned in other halachas is a lady who doesn't show certain female signs of maturity of a certain age. She does not become a zona, and she's allowed to marry a Kohen because her Isser is different. Her negative marry is not the same as that, and she is allowed to marry. 4. The Rambam's still going to continue and explain more of this, so stay tuned. And these, as I mentioned at the beginning, are halachas that are very different and they're relevant in Jewish marriage, that the rabbi, before he does a marriage, needs to make sure that certain situations are not in place when it comes to marriage. But many of these do not play out that regularly in any event. But as I said, the rabbi beforehand, when asking a questionnaire, will ask certain questions as well.
Rabbi, so when the woman, she is not Jewish and she convert, she still have the title of zona?
No. Okay. No, not a someone who, but she's not allowed to marry a Cohen.
Yeah.
So in other words, she might have the title of zona in regards to marrying a Cohen, yes.
Okay.
But she's allowed to marry anyone else. She's not allowed to marry a Cohen.
Okay, so the past doesn't count. Right now, when she convert, she is a new person, except for the Cohen, obviously.
Correct.
Okay.
Let's the Rambam's going to spell it a little bit further, but let's go to 4. If someone had relations with what we call the shniyot, okay, that we learned already earlier in these halachas, these are further relatives that you're not allowed to marry, but they're not the immediate core. The immediate core is the rishon, the primary, shniyot is the secondary level, and thirds, etc. For example, if someone had relations with a lady he did chalitza. Chalitza is the yavama instead of marrying, they did chalitza. And a relative of that lady, does not make her a zaina, because he's not allowed, he is allowed to marry her minat Torah. The rabbis made a decree and they made this secondary level of relations that you're not allowed to marry as well. So since from the Torah perspective, you are allowed to marry, you will not become a zona, even though technically, certain cases you still can't marry according to the Rabbanan. Hey, the Rambam kind of sums it up. Let's look at 5 now. Lamadita, so we learned the following. That whether a lady is considered a zona or is not contingent upon doing a forbidden relation act. For as we saw that someone who has relations was a nida, which is forbidden. A kedesha, which is a lady who allows herself to relations with anyone. Promiscuous lifestyle. Vanirvas labehema, or had relations with an animal. Nivelas be'ila shel isra, they have done a forbidden act. You are not allowed to have those kind of relations. But nonetheless, you do not become a zaina. On the other hand, Misha Nisas l'chalal, someone who married a chalal, nivala be'ila shel heta, you're allowed to marry a chalal. As we will eventually explain when we talk about it, but Vanasa Zaina, she still does become a Zaina. A Chalal is a relationship particularly involving a Kohen, and that's why Zona, which particularly involves primarily a Kohen, has a particular aspect of it. So the Rambam's summing it up, and let's keep reading at the top of the next line. And the matter is not contingent upon the forbidden intimate relationship. It's forbidden based on the pegima. Pegima literally means like a blemish, a spiritual blemish. And the Torah explains those. What is a spiritual blemish? We don't understand that. And the Torah says it's only from certain people that she's forbidden to, or from this chalal. So in other words, when you use the term Zaina, it's not a term to be thrown around. Anyone who is in a relationship they should not have been, or anyone who had relations they were forbidden to have had. It's only particular, narrowly described, as we said till now. Now the Rambam continues with other circumstances along from here as well. Vav 6 Kalanevelas le'adam she'oisa zona. Whenever someone had relationships with a person who will make her a zona, bein ba'onis bein beratzon, whether intentionally or unintentionally, against her will, if you wish, bein bezadim bein bishkaga, deliberately or forgetful, she didn't know. Bein kedarka bein shalei kedarka, whether she had relations in the normal sense or in a non-normal sense. Mishahira ba nisl mishum zaina, when they had the moment of connection, of relation, of penetration, then she becomes a zona. She has to be at least 3 years old in one day. And as we learned already, that the only time a relationship counts as an intimate moment is when he's 9 and she's at least 9 and she's at least 3. Therefore, someone who is married and engages in what we were going to call adultery, whether only or against her will, Nisla Lakuna is forbidden to marry a Kohen. Zion, Ashes Kohen Shenenza. What happens to the wife of a Kohen who was raped? Her husband is not allowed to remain married to her. There'll be more definitions of this for a moment, but at this point, the pasuk says her husband, her first husband, can no longer take her back to be with her since she was spiritually blemished. Hakol b'chlal. This means, this is a general principle, that if everybody, this is a general, it's not about a Kohen, this pasuk, it's because it's a statement that anybody who had relationships with their husband and now became forbidden to their husband, are no longer allowed to be with their husband. In other words, if they have adultery, no longer allowed to be with their husband. Then the Torah comes along with a detail and says that the wife of a Jew, not a Kohen, in other words, Yisrael, not a Kohen. I mean, they're all Jewish, obviously, but a Yisrael who does adultery, she is allowed. She may continue to live with her husband. She never, like it says, that she was not seized. As we'll learn a little more of the details here and later on, whether it's against her will or with her will, etc. In other words, the following. There's a general rule. This is one of the first rules we're learning in this chapter. If the Torah gives something as a cloud, a general rule, and then gives a prat, and then sort of gives a detail of that different, then you follow that detail. So here the Torah comes along and says, anybody who's married and she has adultery, she's no longer allowed to be married. Then the Torah comes along and says, except if she's married to Israel, she is allowed to be married, which means that a Kohen is not, because he was not taken out of the general rule. That's what the Rambam's saying here.
Rabbi, but if it's a rape, she was raped. So, I mean, and so is it, in this moment, he must to divorce as a Kohen?
A Kohen, yes.
Oh.
But she was raped. I mean, she was raped. So it's like, it's not like she did something. It's a rape. So, I mean.
Correct. A spiritual blemish is something we don't understand. And we're going to get into more particulars, and not only in this chapter, but going down further as well. But there's a certain aspect of the relationship of what a Kohen is kind of commanded to do, just like they can't touch an impure body. Even if it's a great mitzvah to go bury someone, a Kohen is not supposed to do that. There are a lot of things that we don't understand that in the Kohen's makeup, they're not supposed to do. Now, I've heard people use an analogy, and it's not exact, but certain people are allergic or even deathly allergic to certain foods. It doesn't matter why they eat it or how they eat it, they did it by mistake. If they eat those foods, their body will react. In a certain sense, a Kohen's spiritual body reacts a certain way to certain things, impurity, azona, etc. And therefore, the Torah says they should not do that. Now, is that something you and I can necessarily put our finger on empirically and explain? No, obviously not. So there are more details to this story. We're going to get into some of them later in this chapter and later on as well. It's not, this is the general rule, but stay tuned as we go through more of it. But again, the Torah was very clear that the wife of a Yisrael is allowed to remarry, but the wife of a Kohen remains forbidden.
Okay, thank you.
Let's keep going. Ches, Eishes Yisrael Shenetza, when the wife of a Yisrael was raped, even though she's allowed to remain married to her husband, we just said, nonetheless, she's no longer allowed to marry a Kohen, like we just said, which means that if she divorces her first husband, she's not allowed to marry a Kohen anyway. She's a divorcee. But if her first husband dies, now she would be a widow. She's still not allowed to marry a Kohen, but she is allowed to marry another Yisrael. If a wife of a Kohen tells her husband, Nenasti or Shaganti, I was raped, or I had an accident and I didn't realize what I was doing, and I had a relationship with someone else. Or one witness comes along and says she did adultery. Again, whether it was with her will or against her will, in this case, the Rambam says she is not usher. Why? Perhaps she decided that she's going to use that to get out of the marriage. And therefore, perhaps if she comes along, if we don't have a set of knowledge of this, but she comes along and tells her husband, "Oh, I was in an adulterous relationship. Now you have to let me go." The Torah Rambam says you don't have to let her go. But if the husband believes his wife or believes this one witness, and really trust them, he should let her go to remove the doubts. In other words, if his best friend or his rabbi or someone who he absolutely trusts comes over and says, I'm one witness, but I know your wife had an adulterous relationship, and he believes it, he should let her go because there's a doubt in his mind that's been arisen. But halachically, he's allowed to remain, the Cohen's allowed to remain married. Test. And now we're going to continue in this scenario. The Rambam says that the wife of a Kohen who says to her husband, I was raped. Just like, even though she's allowed to remain married to her husband, as we just said a minute ago, she's now forbidden to any other Kohen in the world. Why? Obviously, after her husband dies, she can't go marry two husbands anyways. But Jerry Haidas, she admitted that she's a zona. And made herself forbidden. So if her husband dies, she cannot marry another Kohen based on her words. So her husband can remain married to her, but another Kohen could not. Yud, number 10, Kohen shekidelo ketana. If a Kohen goes ahead and betroths a lady, makes a kiddushin, whether she's an older or a younger, then when they got married a while later, or when they eventually got married a little bit, first they got engaged and a while later they got married. And when they got married in relations, he says, I realized that she had relations previously. In other words, now I'm concerned. Maybe she's forbidden to me. Nestra Olavi Suffolk. So she is forbidden from the Suffolk. What does that Suffolk mean? There's a doubt here. What's the doubt? Shemakaidim Kiddushin Nivala or Acher Kiddushin? Because maybe she had relations before they got married, or maybe before the engagement, if you wish, or maybe afterwards. And that will make a difference in whether she's considered a zona or not. Because we learned earlier that an unmarried lady that has relations is not considered a zona and is not forbidden to Kohen. So if it happened before they got married, before they did the kiddushin, she's still permitted to him. If it happened in the time period between the kiddushin and they getting married, then it would be forbidden. So it's a doubt. So therefore, we have to say you have to stop the marriage because it's a doubt. We don't know what to say. Av Yisrael shita on tainazu like Yisrael, but a Yisrael and not Cohen, this doesn't apply. Sheyishkan shnei sveikas. There are two sveikas here. Why? Shema kreidim kiddushin, shema acher kiddushin. Maybe it happened, like we said, before they got married, or maybe after they got married. That's number one. But here, Shema ba'ines vafilu nemar acher kiddushin. Even if it happened after the kiddushin happened, Shema ba'ines, Shema beratzon. Whether it was ba'ines, whether it was beratzon, maybe it was against her wishes. And then when it comes to Yisrael, we've explained that a lady who is raped against her will can remain married to her husband. So in this case, the question was, did she do it willingly, engage in adultery, or was she forced against her wishes and non-consensually? So therefore, it's called a sveka. Now, here's another one of the general principles that we learn in halacha. One suffix, if there's one doubt, it does not automatically allow you to go forward. If there are two doubts, and usually the two doubts have to be intertwined with each other, then you can continue to do so. And there's loads and loads of pages of Talmudic and Shulchan Aruch expressions trying to understand these principles. But here, by a Yisrael, there's a double doubt. Number one, did it happen before Kiddushin or after Kiddushin? And even if it happened after Kiddushin, was it done willingly or not willingly? So they're intertwined, double doubt, Yisrael could keep it. By a Kohen, we don't have that second doubt, because whether willingly or whether not willingly, the Kohen has to let her go. So therefore, we only have one doubt. One doubt does not allow us to just continue. That's the general principle in halacha called sveka, of a double doubt. So I'm just highlighting it. Again, we're not going to spend hours on it, and yeshiva people go for days and days and days on it, but just explaining it as we come across it. Lefichach, now the Rambam says, therefore, with that understanding, let's go further. If a father, we already learned, is allowed to marry off his daughter. His daughter's 2.5 years old. He comes over to someone and says, I want to marry off my daughter, do a kiddushin. And the fellow says, I will marry your daughter. Now, they don't actually live together. She's 2.5 years old. And they go ahead and live together a little while later, whenever she gets a little older, obviously. Then he says, it looks like she had already had relations with someone else. Nestor alav misafik. Then there's a one suffix here. One suffix means it's forbidden, even though he's Yisrael. Why? She'enkan ala suffix echad. Because all we know is if the doubt of was ba'ones or not beratzon. The first doubt in the last paragraph was before the kiddushin or after the kiddushin. When she's 2.5 years old, there was no situation possible before the kiddushin. So that doubt is removed. So all we're left with is only one doubt. Did she do it willingly? Did she do it not willingly? One doubt is not enough for us to keep moving. And one doubt, we have to go to Chumrah, we have to be strict. So I gave you the background so you'll understand why here, when you remove one of the doubts, the Yisrael becomes equal to the Kohen with one doubt, and then we have to go to be stringent. Your base, 12. We're going to try to keep moving because there's a lot to cover here. 12. As we learned in the laws of Saita, if any time a husband told his wife, I don't want you to be with someone, and she was. And she says, I'm not drinking this water. Remember, the water was the process to discover if she was guilty or not. She's forbidden to the kayin. Because now we don't know. Maybe she did adultery, maybe she didn't do adultery. Maybe she's suffix zona. Perhaps she's a zona. We don't know the case. Whether she doesn't want to drink, or whether her husband says, I don't want her to have a drink. I don't want to go through the process with her. We learned in the halachas that if one witness comes, it will forbid her from drinking because it's ve'edein bo no witnesses. If she has even one witness, she can't drink. Ben shekanal abezdin, ben shaisim in anoshim shenerus lishtais. The Rambam lists off 4 different situations why maybe she's not drinking the water. She doesn't want to, he doesn't want to, there's a witness, it comes from Bezin. Nonetheless, in our circumstance, here, since we don't know if she did adultery or not, it doesn't matter why she's not drinking. The fact is we don't have clarity, therefore she cannot marry a Kohen. 13. If a unmarried lady has relations with someone, and they say to her, who was this person who he had relations with? Adam kosher. He was a kosher person. In other words, he was someone I'm allowed to be with. It's not a non-Jew, and it wasn't all the other things that could have been forbidden. What is the halacha? She is believed, and therefore she can not a zayna, and she can marry a Kohen. It's not just that even if she's pregnant. From who did you become pregnant? From Adam kosher, from a person who's acceptable. She is believed, just her word. We believe her word, and she's allowed to marry a Kohen.
What's mean acceptable?
She's not a non-Jew, and etc. And she wasn't married. It's a lot less of an individual that would be narco, but someone she's not allowed to be with.
Okay.
In other words, a normal circumstance, unfortunately, of an unmarried person who has relations, and they say, "Who was it?" And she said, "It was a nice Jewish boy, but we did whatever we did."
But she allowed to marry the priest, even she was not married to this person?
Yes. Because she was not married, it wasn't forbidden for them to technically have relations. They could have gotten married, these two. A zona that becomes forbidden to a priest is only when there's an isser involved, a prohibition.
Okay.
That's what I'm telling you from the beginning. You remember the term zona is very finely defined in halacha. It's not a broad term like people sometimes insinuate based on usage today or what they think it might mean.
No,
now,
but the point is, I mean, Kohen, the standard, the high Kohen, or the standard of the Kohen to marry somebody who is practically a virgin. I mean, it's only applied to the high Kohen, correct?
Correct. A basula is only to the high.
But the definition to somebody who was in relationship with many men to apply to Kohen, even if he's acceptable, it's look a little bit like, excuse me, what kind of woman she is.
That's a different question. Number one, it could be a person who changed her lifestyle around completely and now is the most, define however you want, most religious lady in the block. But if she technically has the title of a zona from her earlier lifestyle, she still can't marry a Kohen, even though today she's the greatest person. She can marry Yisrael. She can't marry a Kohen.
Yeah. Okay, let's go.
But now the Rambam clarifies this a little bit more in another interesting way. But Medvarmor, what are we talking about? 14 Yudalid, Kishayam, Makim Shnivle, Precious Drachim, if it was out in the field, that's a thoroughfare. We're going to explain in a minute exactly what the Rambam means. Let's read through it. And the majority of the people who used it thoroughfare were what we call ksherim, acceptable people. And the city that leads into the thoroughfare, majority of them are also ksherim. The Chachamim wanted to make sure, kind of make an extra level of concern when it comes to the lineage of who can marry who. So they demanded 2 majorities. Normally, we follow 1 majority. And as long as you have 1 majority say something's allowed, it's allowed. When it comes to the lineage of marriage here, the Chachamim, the sages added as 2. So you need both the majority of the thoroughfare people to be kasherim, acceptable, and the majority of the city that leads into the thoroughfare also to be acceptable. But if the thoroughfare was normally flooded and people, not flooded, but people who went there, the passerbys were not acceptable, non-Jews, etc. Even though this city that leads to the thoroughfare is mostly acceptable, or the reverse. The city was not acceptable. That the majority of the thoroughfare were acceptable. We're concerned that maybe she had relations with someone she's forbidden to have. To begin with, she should not marry a kohen. But
all right, can I ask a question?
Well, hold on 1 second.
Okay, sure.
But if she did go ahead and marry a kohen, she should not divorce him. She should not leave. In other words, well, I get to the question 1 more second. In other words, that technically Minat Torah, 1 majority would have been enough. If the majority of people in the thoroughfare were acceptable, that would have been enough to marry kohen. If the majority of the city would have been acceptable, would have been enough to marry kohen. But the Chachamim wanting to add a little bit more of a fence around marriage and lineage said, here you need 2 majorities. So only if both majorities work out can you marry a kohen. If only 1, you shouldn't marry a kohen. But if you did, technically the Torah does allow you to. So therefore, you don't need to get divorced. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So what? I lost my train of thought. So what if the Kohen has relations with a woman before he gets married, and that's the woman though that he's going to marry? So or that they want to get married. So how do you work that?
So number 1, this is in a real practical way. This is something that the rabbi of any particular marriage will have to deal with. And when you're dealing with marrying a kohen, there's more questions to ask. But technically, if she was never married before,
right,
having relations with the kohen may not cause an issue here to the Zona conversation. The Zona conversation would only be, what if she went ahead and had relations before she got married with someone that was forbidden?
Okay.
Kohen.
Okay.
So, in other words, technically speaking, before a Kohen gets married, the rabbi is supposed to ask the fiance of the Kohen, or at least show them these halachas to read and say, do you fit the qualifications? It means, have you not had relations with a non-Jew? Have you not done adultery, etc., etc.? And if she says, I fit, like we just read, everything I did was fine for the Kohen, then you can get married.
Yeah. Okay.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Rabbi, going back to the previous question regarding the woman who have a relationship with somebody, even she has a child from this previous relationship, she allowed to marry Kohen, correct?
That's what we said, that if she says that the person that I had the child with is acceptable, we believe her.
Wow. Okay.
Which, by the way, I'm going to put this out there, but I really don't want to open a whole can of worms. So maybe, but a lot of people may have this understanding that in Torah law, we don't believe women. It's not true. The fact that a woman doesn't do testimony in a court is a separate conversation, but we believe women. And if she comes and says, I'm pregnant, we don't know who she's pregnant with, we believe her word. We trust her.
No, this part I understand, but to come and to say this child is from somebody acceptable, as you describe, and we trust, and we don't know to some point if it's acceptable or not, because it's her child, and she must to protect the child, because whatever she did, it's not child's fault. but for a Cohen to accept it and to go forward and to
Okay,
give his
so
name to the child, because he accepts the child as it's his child. I mean, practically.
well, hold one more second, because there still is one more clarification here, or not clarification, qualification, that's going to add a little bit more detail into this question. The Rambam started off as a general rule, we trust her. Now the Rambam's telling you that if it was outside the city and the thoroughfare was majority acceptable, and the city was majority acceptable, because we need two majorities, two rows. Now the Rambam says an interesting halacha. And again, we're learning these halachas, and some of them in the situations that play out practically need to be dealt with in each situation. But 15, Tezvav, Reruah shenivla be'ir, oinis abra be'ir. What if she had her relations in the city, or she became pregnant in the city? In other words, she wasn't hanging out on the streets in the fields outside. Even if this entire city had only one non-Jew, you should not marry, to begin with, marry a Kohen. So here's a little bit of what your concern was. Why? And here's the next general principle in halacha, which again in yeshiva takes up days, and it applies in many halachas, the laws of kosher, the laws of marriage. And I'm sorry that this chapter is seeming to take a little bit longer, but just so you should understand the background here for a minute, there's a general rule that kol hakavua kemechsa mechsatami. Whenever something is established, we can't just follow a majority. A more common question would be, if I find a piece of meat in the street and I don't know if it's kosher, if the city has 10 kosher butchers, of course it's kosher. That's all you have. What if the city has 5 kosher butchers, let's say 2 kosher butchers and 8 non-kosher butchers? So then you're going to say that I find it in the street, called the parish, meruba parish. Whatever we found separate must have come from the majority. If the majority butchers are not kosher, the meat is not kosher. If the majority butchers are kosher, we might say the meat is kosher. That's if I find it alone out of the place of the doubt. But if I find it in the store, now, not necessarily the kosher, non-kosher store, because that would answer your question, but kind of not separate in a way, but in the location of the stores, I might say, called the kavua kamechsa mechsa. So I don't look at a majority, I looked at anything that's established is equal to the other half. So even if there's 2 non-kosher and 8 kosher stores, if it's found there by the stores, then I would say kavua is half and half. I don't know if it's kosher. Here the Rambam is taking that same principle and saying when she's out in the street, out of the city, in the field, she now left the city. What was the city? Majority acceptable. So she's from the majority. But now in the city itself, the Rambam is going to tell you that kol kavua kamechsa mechsa. That in the city, it's as if she's established. And in the city of establishment, we don't look at majority. We looked at they're all equal. So no longer do we have such clarity to say she's for sure okay to marry a Kohen. Because in the city, since there's some doubt, and we give that doubt equal footing to all other doubts, so it's 50-50. Therefore, to begin with, she should not marry a Kohen. Let's see it inside. To begin with, she should not marry a Kohen. Anything that's established is as if it's half and half. But therefore, but if she went ahead and married the Kohen, and then the rabbi hears the whole story, so the rabbi can't tell her to divorce, because again, it's a doubt still. There's no clarity. She said, I did it to an acceptable person. I had relations with an acceptable person. Therefore, we can't say to get divorced from the Kohen. We also cannot tell you to marry the Kohen. So therefore, to begin with, don't, but if you did, remain married. Unlike in the street outside the city, where we're not looking at the majority being equal to halves, we're looking at the majority overruling the minority. I hope that gives some background. This is something, again, in yeshiva called the parish meruba parish. Anything that's separate is considered from the majority, but yet something which is established is considered half and half. Tezayin. We're going to keep going, and I hope, again, as I said, I add a little yeshiva background to that. If she is a lady who was either, as the Rambam said, may have been deaf or dumb, or she doesn't know who she had relation with, or she was too young to know the difference between who's acceptable and not acceptable, now we have a doubt. We have no way to clarify this doubt. But here, the doubt is so strong that if she marries a Kohen, she should get divorced. Unless the majority of, like, she was out of the city, majority of the thoroughfare, majority of the city were both kosher, acceptable, then we could put that into play. But if not, she's not giving us any room to clarify the doubt. Therefore, we say, don't get married. If you get married, leave. The earlier case, she gave us clarity. We just don't know if we can halachically accept that clarity to the doubt. So we're in a doubt. Here we're not really being put into doubt because she's not telling us anything. If the two majorities are in place, that's clarifying our doubt, and we go with that. 17. Hashfuya sheniftis. Is a lady was taken captive. She's 3 years older. Asura Lakuna, she's no longer allowed to marry a Kohen. We'll learn a little bit more about the details of this in a minute, but the Gemara's time accepted a rule that if a lady was taken captive by pirates, by people running around wild, then they probably rape, pillage, plunder, and they probably had relations with this lady. And since we don't know, we have to go on that. But now, it's not so simple. Stay tuned to all the details. That's the general approach to begin the conversation. Therefore, she's forbidden to her Kohen. She's suffix zayna, because it's a suffix, and it's a strong suffix. See, that's what these people do when they take captives. If she has a witness that says that the non-Jew is never alone with her, then she's allowed to marry a Kohen. So as long as we can get out of the doubt, we don't accept that as an absolute. That even a slave or a maid or a relative is allowed to be that witness, even though they're not allowed to regularly be a witness in halacha. Here they are. The Rambam says an amazing thing. If two women were taken captive, and when they're freed, each one says that I know that the other one was never alone with a non-Jew, we believe both of them. Since all of these doubts were put on by the rabbis based on the time about trying to understand what captors do, so we wanted to make it easier for them to return to normal civil society in the Jewish community and get married. So therefore we allow certain things that we won't normally allow. So here, two women who were captive can each testify for each other. This is a kilu b'shvuya, making it easier for the lady taken captive. Yudches 18. The Rambam continued, even if it was a child who told the story and said, I know that she was never alone. This is why I know it. And I'll tell you the story. We believe him. The Rambam breathes down the story that there was a lady who was a child and a mother were taken captive. And he was telling over what happened during captivity. We were taken captive between the non-Jews. They took us captive. But when I went to get water, I kept my mind and kept paying attention to my mother. I cared for her. I went out to get wood for the fireplace. I made sure to pay attention to what my mother was doing. The Chachamim allowed a Kohen to marry her based on the testimony of this child who said, I made sure to keep an eye on my mother, and I know that nothing went on. Your test, 19. A husband's not allowed to. Because here his testimony is affecting himself. You're not allowed to say testimony for yourself. So if a husband and wife are taken captive, he can't say, I stood by her side and no non-Jew was with her, but perhaps he's trying to cover up to remain married. So that we don't say. And her maidservant. A maidservant is believed, but not her maidservant. But the maidservant of her husband, in those days, I guess they each had their own maidservant who remained with them, that would be allowed. Her maidservant telling a story would be believed. Testimony, when I'm premeditated, I'm thinking about what to say, we don't believe. But story, we would believe. Now again, it's getting late. I'm going to keep going until I finish the chapter. If anybody does need to leave for whatever circumstances, I understand. I will download the chapter and put it up on the YouTube Rambam channel as soon as I finish anyways, but you're welcome to stay with me as we go through it here. Your test. Ein abal, no, oh no, we did that. Chaf, I'm sorry. Kawit shehid l'shvuya. Shehi tahara the loisena. Kayan who comes along and says, I know that she was not ever alone with a non-Jew. He's not allowed to marry her. Shemein of Dustinba. Maybe he just fell in love with her and is trying to find a way to marry her. He said it, but if he walked over to the captors and put down money, ransom, to free her, then we do trust him. Why? If he didn't really know that he could go ahead and marry her, he would not have put money down for her. So when you put your money where your mouth is, the Rambam says we trust her. Chaf Aleph. The lady walks into town one day. Nobody knows her. Nobody knows her background. And she says, by the way, I want you to know, I was taken captive, but I'm pure. I had no relationship with anyone. We believe her. Here is another general Gemara principle again. Takes a long time to understand. Not to understand, I'm thinking in conversation, when it applies, how it applies. Hapesha aser, hu hapesha hiter. If you are not forbidden, and you are the one who makes yourself forbidden, your mouth, Pemi's mouth, sha'aser makes you forbidden, and simultaneously, pesha hiter, your mouth makes you allowed, permitted, we believe you. And the difference, as we're going to learn in the next few lines, is the following. When witnesses come along and say you were taken captive, so now it's nothing to do with you. We know you were taken captive because the witnesses said so. So the fact that you say, I was never alone with anyone, I never had any relations, we don't know if we can believe you. Maybe you're just covering up. But if nobody ever knew you were captive, and you said, I was taken captive, right away you go, oh, maybe you're forbidden, but I'm telling you, I was never alone. The only way we know you're forbidden was you. We rely on you also to allow. Hapesha aser, hu hapesha hiter. It's another principle in halacha that is used across with lots of conversation. We're going to see in the next couple of paragraphs how it applies. So here she comes to town and says, I was taken captive, but I was okay. We believe her. Why? Hapesha aser, hapesha hiter. Turn the page. And even if one witness kind of then comes along and says that she was taken captive, we believe her because she's the one who created the scenario of prohibition, simultaneously creating the scenario of permission. But if there's two witnesses who said she was taken captive, then it's not her making herself forbidden, and we don't believe it. Until, like we said before, that you have one witness that says you're pure. Now the Rambam could get a whole scenario here. Bear with us. Let's go through this. Two witnesses come along and say you're taken captive. And then one witness comes along and says, I know you were alone and you had relations. And one witness says, no, you're not telling the truth. She was never alone. And she was ever alone with a non-Jew. That even if this one who says she is allowed is a lady or a maid or someone like we said before who normally may not be accepted for witness for testimony, here we trust them. So even though it's not them creating the prohibition, because two witnesses clearly said you were taken captive, nonetheless, the one cancels out the one enough that we can rely on that one to let her go ahead and get married. Chav Beis. Misha Amr Nishpesi Tarani, someone said I was taken captive and I'm pure. V'tirua Bezalin Nasa, like we said before, Bezalin says, go ahead and get married, it's fine. And then two witnesses show up and say, oh, we know that you're taken captive. So she's still allowed to get married and retain that permission that Bezdin, that the court gave her to get married. And even if her captor enters afterwards. In other words, he's trying to get his ransom. So he comes in and says, by the way, she's my captive. He's holding on to her. At that moment, she was allowed to get married. Although she said it before he kind of walked in, and we realized that he was still in power over her. She's still permitted. Why? Once we go ahead and give her the permission, we don't take it back. And from this moment, even though the captive has control, we're going to do our best to make sure to stand over and make sure nothing happens to her. So even though until we get the money, until we work out the details, we're going to make sure they're not alone. So again, if the witnesses come before she makes a statement, then she won't get the permission. But if she comes before the witnesses and gets the permission, then the witnesses won't change it later on. Chav Gimel. But now what happens if she was allowed to get married? She gets married, she even has children. And then two witnesses show up and say, well, we were captives with her, or we knew what was going on, and she clearly was together with a non-Jew. So she has to leave her marriage, because then we have two witnesses stating that the permission was granted inaccurately. If it's just one witness, we don't believe, like we said before. She says, I was taken captive and I'm pure. And not just that, I have witnesses to prove it. We don't say, we don't say, well, bring your witnesses and we'll see what they say. No, if it's you are the one saying you're forbidden, and you're the one saying you're permitted, you're allowed to get married, go get married. Witnesses are come, don't come, we trust you. Even if the word goes out in the street that she has witnesses that she wasn't pure, she was in a relationship. Matir said we allow her to get married based on this scenario of her being the one to set it up. And we don't say, well, maybe the witnesses will come and say she'll be forbidden. When they come, we'll deal with them. Again, by a captive, we have a certain leniency because the Chachamim wanted her to be able to sort of get back into society, so we don't push her off. Chavdalet. If a father says, I was Makadish, I betrothed my daughter. Vigerashtia, then she was divorced. If she's still a katan under the age of where a father is allowed to marry off a daughter, he's believed. And therefore now she's considered as a divorcee. But if he said it when she was no longer a child, but she was an adult, then he's not believed. Because the Torah does not give permission except when the daughter is young, not when the daughter is old. So therefore his word doesn't have effect. Nishpesa, if he said that my daughter was taken captive and I redeemed her, whether she was a child or whether she was an adult, his word is not believed. Torah only allowed him to marry her off and all the ensuing for future forbidden relationships from being in marriage. of a loyal apostle, but Torah does not allow him to have any right to make her quote unquote a zona in this case. So therefore, his word saying that she was taken captive is not believed. If she says I'm not, nobody ever heard I was taken captive other than my father telling the story, we don't believe the father. Chafei 25. The wife of Kayan, who now became forbidden because she was taken captive. Since it's still a doubt, we don't really know that she had relations forbidden. We just making this assumption based on the majority of cases. They can live in one community. One chutzah literally means one courtyard area. But you have to live with other people. In other words, when a husband and wife are forbidden to be together, for now they have to separate them for whatever reason, they're not allowed to live right next door to each other because we're concerned that that familiarity will breed a not safe environment for the two of them in this relationship, which is forbidden. But here, since it's only a doubt, we're not ultimately that worried, number one, but still the Rambam said there should be people around so the two of them will not find themselves alone together. Chavav, some other fascinating halachas. The Rambam is taking some of these ideas to the next step now. An entire city was taken siege. If the captivating force circled the entire city, in order that not a single person, man or lady, could escape. In other words, here now any lady in the city is trapped by this force who can do whatever they want to. At that point, the entire city, all the women inside, who, as the city is overrun by this force, who circled the city, so there was no escape route, they're all considered captives under them, and therefore they're all forbidden to going. Unless someone was under 3 years old at that point in time. But so that's a big statement. That you just made an entire city. But the Rambam continues. If it was possible that even one lady could escape the city and they wouldn't know, or in the city there's one hiding place. Even if it only held one lady, one person. In other words, one lady can escape or one lady could hide. It saves everyone. What does that mean? Rambam continues, 28. Keta Matelas, what does it mean? She rescues everyone. Any lady in that city who now says, I am pure, I was never raped, I was never had any relationship with any of this force. Even though she has no witnesses, it doesn't matter. Since she could have said, I was that one who escaped. Or even insulted. Or I hid it, I'm the one who hid in that one hiding place. The men is so she's allowed to say again, here's the Pesha Oster aspect. She's allowed to say, I didn't escape, but I'm pure. And since technically there was a way she could have not been seen as forbidden, and she's coming along and sharing with us that she is forbidden, since she's the one telling us she's forbidden and also telling us she's permitted, we believe her. The Rambam continues to qualify this. What does this apply? Malchus in a battalion from that country's kingdom. Shem is Yashib because the country, when the force is from the government and they take over a city, they live there. They're not scared of anyone. They are the authorities. Therefore, we're concerned maybe they have relations with the women. But if it was a passing force that passed through the town, rape, pillage, plunder, and runs off, the women in the town are not forbidden. Because the passing force doesn't have time to sit there and rape and find relations with every lady in town. They're worried about, they're watching their back. So they want to grab the spoils of war and run with it. But what if part of the spoils of war were women? They took women captive, and it became under the control of this force. Even though other Jews in town started to chase and eventually free them, since there's a significant time period that they were under the control of this passing force and they were alone with them, then all the same halacha we've been saying till now apply to them. And unless she could say, find a way to have witnesses or someone else, and that she's pure, she cannot marry a Kohen. Lamed. If a lady was taken captive for money, she's allowed to be back with her husband with a Kohen. If she was imprisoned, so to say, for matters involving a capital punishment, then she is not. So here's more an imprisonment by the authorities. If it's about money, so they treat you a certain way. If it's about capital punishment, then they treat you another way. So in this case, if it's for nefashos, once they kind of write you off and say they're going to kill you, they can go ahead and say they're going to do whatever they want to you before they kill you. They're called. But if it's money, they know they have to return her to her husband. They're not going to do anything. When does this apply? When the Jews had a certain dominion over the non-Jews of the time. And they were scared of them. But at a time when the non-Jewish authorities were strong and powerful over the Jews, and they were not scared, at that point, I feel like they mummied, even if she's taken captive because of money, since she's under their domain, their control, she would be forbidden to Kayin. Unless she has someone, like we said before, testifying that she is okay, she's kosher, and then she can go back to her Kayin. And that finishes the parak.